Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Laura.
I'm Kate.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
Today, we're sitting down to discuss Golden Hill by Francis Spufford, a romping, rollicking historical novel set in New York, 1746, and the latest book read by Laura's book club.
It won the Costa Book Award in 2016, the Royal Society of Literature's Ondaatje Prize, and the Desmond Elliott Prize for New Fiction, and has been described as the best 18th century novel since the 18th century. But was it? What did my book club make of it? Keep listening to find out.
Hi, Laura.
Hi, Kate.
It's a sunny Saturday. Listeners may be able to hear the slightly unhistorical sound of my neighbour's leaf blower out there, but hopefully
On and off.
You won't be able to pick that up. Now, I wouldn't say Laura and I, we don't really have any particular expertise in 18th century novels, so we've brought someone in. We're delighted to be joined in the studio today by Phyllis Richardson, lecturer in English at Goldsmiths University, author of several books on architecture and design, and most recently her book House of Fiction, Great British Houses in Literature and Life. Phyllis, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here.
So House of Fiction is one of my very favourite things, in that it's a book about books, from Pemberley to Brideshead. Do you want to explain to our listeners a little bit more about it?
From Pemberley to Brideshead. Now that came from the publishers, I have to say, because they were a bit worried whether people would understand what houses in literature meant. What was interesting to me was when I started doing it, and I would say to people, I'm researching houses that appear in great works of fiction or popular works of fiction and how they connected with the writers. So many people said to me, oh, what a great idea. Are you doing Beatrix Potter? No, I'm not really doing Beatrix Potter. I'm saying it has to be an author who's written a book in which a house has a very central role somehow, either as an inheritance or a setting, or, as people often say, another character in the novel. So I got really interested in just how many novels had at its core, either spiritually or thematically, or even just, as I said, in the setting, some significant house. And so I thought, is this a British thing? It does occur in American literature, and it occurs in lots of literature of different countries. But I came to feel that it was a particularly British thing in terms of the number of well-known or popular novels for which there was a house, even in the title, like Brideshead or something, Howard's End, all the novels of Jane Austen, for example. So I thought to myself, well, is this a cultural thing? Is it a personal thing to do with the authors? Is it something in their lives? Was there a house that was important? And so I wanted to find out whether there were those sorts of connections.
What surprised me about it slightly was when I started, I thought I would enjoy the chapters where I had read those authors more. For example, Jane Austen, I'm reasonably familiar with the works of Jane Austen. And what I found to my surprise was actually it was the authors that I hadn't ever read that intrigued me. It was just such a lovely way of finding out about them. So Walter Scott, and you sort of learn about his love for castles that he visited and those sort of ancestral homes, and then his own home that he built. Abbotsford, was it called?
Abbotsford,
That's
yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And I don't know anything about Walter Scott, and I found that really fascinating.
Well, he was the first real celebrity novelist to be really popular and well paid in his time beyond England, beyond the UK. Sorry, he's Scottish. And that's a very important point that he's Scottish, because what he's doing in his novels essentially is setting out this great heritage of Scotland and this kind of very noble lineage of the various heroes that he's talking about, and the reasons why they might be so impassioned to fight against the English. But what he ends up doing in all of the novels that deal with England and Scotland is uniting them under some sort of equally noble English patronage. And part of that lineage, that heritage of Scotland that he is bringing forward, and he really did popularize all that stuff, the tartans and the music and these characters. I mean, that really is Walter Scott. But these manor houses, these particular Scottish baronial style of architecture, he absolutely embraced that. And when he came to have his own house, he sort of manifests this legendary attachment to these houses in Abbotsford. At first, he wasn't going to do much to it, and then he started making changes to it, and then he started going around and picking up all these relics from other places, particularly in Edinburgh, because the new town was being built and lots of stuff was being discarded, and he wrote loads of letters about, how he'd found this bit of rock or this bit of a turret and this thing, and he was going to put it over and make it look like an ancient well and all this kind of stuff. And he just started picking all this stuff up and just sticking it onto his house and making himself in the image of a Scottish laird, as if in his own poetic imagination.
It's such a nice way of learning about a writer and getting another kind of insight into their work when you look at the places that they lived and what those houses meant to them. I love the way there was almost this kind of sort of grand designs aspect to it, you know. He chased down these pieces of stonework that he wanted, or I was remembering, was it Horace Walpole and Strawberry Hill?
Yes.
And he loved it so much, and he created this extraordinary house, and it was his real passion, wasn't it? And there was a sense in that chapter that perhaps he was somewhat frustrated in other aspects of his life that he couldn't really express, and so it all got poured into this house.
Yeah, Horace Walpole is another really interesting figure. I mean, just go back to Walter Scott to say that the sad thing, very sad thing, he did invest in a publishing house. He lost a lot of money. He almost lost Abbotsford. Actually ended up sort of killing his wife, the debts that they then took on. And Walter Scott spent the rest of his life, once these debts accrued and it looked like he might lose the house, he was allowed to keep it by his creditors, and he literally wrote his way out of debt to save the house. Horace Walpole was born with loads of money. His father was Robert Walpole, the first, or the de facto prime minister. And Horace Walpole was an amazing character. I was sitting in the British Library reading his letters and just cackling to myself because he was so mean, so bitchy.
Like gossipy.
So gossipy. And he just, people like Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who were just like his nemesis. So Horace Walpole is very likely that he was gay. I mean, obviously we don't have evidence to the fact, but he's described in various ways by various people. And he surrounded himself with a group of men he called the Strawberry Committee, or the Committee of Taste. And when he bought the property at Strawberry Hill, he decided he wanted this Gothic castle, as he called it, his little Gothic castle. Unlike Walter Scott, Walpole just didn't really care if things were authentic. He just stuck them on, and he really would have been great with grand designs. He would have loved MDF, just carve it up to look like some turrets and stick it on, and that's Horace. For him, it was more like a stage set, and he quite liked having these kind of quasi-religious, well, not ceremonies, parties, I would call them. They dress up like monks and go around with candles and pretend to be Gothic, but it was all play acting, and he loved that. He loved having a big party at the house. He loved showing it off, but he really had an affinity for this Gothic style. He said he liked what he called gloomth, which was gloom plus warmth. And he loved these kind of special spaces, dark corners and things in Gothic architecture. And he just went a bit crazy at Strawberry Hill. And if you go there, and it's quite wacky. First, you might think, here's a kind of lovely renovated piece of Gothic architecture. When you go in and you realize it's pretty fake.
Yes, I love the bit about gloom. That was great. Well, so speaking of rich in atmosphere, I want to come back to House of Fiction at the end in our recommendations. But for now, let's move on to Golden Hill, shall we? Laura?
Let me tell you a little bit about it. So Golden Hill unfolds over 2 months in mid-18th century New York. On a rainy evening in November, a handsome young stranger arrives fresh off the boat from London in what's still no more than a small trading town. He pitches up at a counting house door in Golden Hill Street. This is Mr. Smith, amiable, charming, yet strangely determined to keep suspicion simmering. For in his pocket, he has what seems to be an order for £1,000, a fortune. But he won't explain why, where it comes from, or what he plans to do with it.
I read this a long time ago. I think I probably read it when it first came out, and there was a real buzz about it. It did keep winning these prizes. I remember a lot of the publicity was around this thing about it won this new fiction award. But the funny thing about that is you have this idea of this sort of young first-time novelist just starting out, and of course he isn't. He's written 5 other books, I think, non-fiction. And I think immediately you start reading, it's incredibly assured and incredibly well written, and you just sort of settle in. You're like, it's great. But it's quite a difficult book to talk about in some ways because it's very hard to discuss the plot without spoilers. So we're going to do a slightly unusual thing. We're going to try and split our show into 2 sections. The first section, we are going to talk more generally about the book, and then if you want to hear the whole thing and you don't mind about the spoilers, stick with us because we will get a bit deeper into it as the show goes on. But for now, where to start?
Let's start with New York. It is 1746, and this is New York, but not as we know it. It was a New York I never even knew existed, really. I don't know much about American history, and so I never really thought about New York's origins and what its status would have been at the time when these small towns that are now huge cities on the eastern seaboard were just starting out. And actually, New York was relatively minor compared, say, to Boston.
one of the things that comes across quite strongly is this idea of this character Smith who arrives, and he's a stranger there. And what's done really wonderfully, I think, is slow unfolding of the social connections, the people that he meets, and gradually and very naturally, it was just so well done. It felt really true and real, the way that you gradually start to get to know things. And so little by little, he meets people and they each bring something into his life, but they're not getting much back, are they?
No, he's keeping everything very close to his heart, especially where has this fortune come from? £1,000 was a huge amount of money for the time.
Did you understand about the money? Did that make sense to you? You know, he comes with this piece of paper and he hands it to this merchant. And the idea is, I think, that then the paper is worth £1,000. He's paid the £1,000 in England. And now he gets to America and he hands the note over. And then that should mean that the merchant, Mr. Lovell, is going to pay him £1,000.
Phyllis, do you know much about this?
Did the money make sense to you?
So the money didn't make sense to me necessarily, but what did make a lot of sense to me was going back to the depiction of New York as this hub of trade. And this period does talk about the slave trade, but it talks about the slave trade as a piece of this mighty bastion of trade that's going on. And I think you get a real sense for that, because there was what was called and is still sometimes called the triangular trade, where ships from Europe are going to Africa, they're picking up slaves, they go to the colonies, they sell those slaves, they take that money, and they sometimes buy kind of natural resources to take back to Europe to sell. They get goods in Europe that they can then sell in the colonies as well. And all of that, I think, is depicted really well in this bartering system almost that's going on, because he says it's not only he's marveling at the various different kinds of money and different printings and different faces on it and qualities of paper, but also what you could trade in rum or wheat or flour or any other good that's being made there. So while New York is this very nascent metropolitan island, Manhattan, you can see he's showing the kind of seeds of the financial center that New York will become, but you see how patchwork it is.
Mm. And if this sounds a little bit dry to listeners, it's not. When you're reading the book, it's really fascinating. My book club was obsessed with this. We talked a lot about the financial system and the money and how it worked, because it's not always clear from the book itself. So it was a great part of the discussion.
I think what he does really well is, in some ways it's abstract, but then in other ways it's very, very real, and it's very, very important. And one of the ways that he ratchets up the tension brilliantly, it's an early event. I think it feels not too spoilery to say that quite early on Smith is careless. He's in a new city. He doesn't behave as sensibly as he should, and he's robbed. And so he's gone from being relatively wealthy when he arrived and with the promise of much more money that's going to come his way, to suddenly he's almost penniless. And he has to conceal this fact, because the only thing he's able to then exist on are the lines of credit that are open to him. And if anyone were to find out that, in fact, his financial circumstances are very different, he'd be in real trouble. So there's this wonderful sense of him trying to eke out his resources. And you really feel for him. You're like, oh, my goodness, will he manage to eat tonight?
And that is an important point, is that he has this promissory note for £1,000, but the banking house in London will be sending other notes to prove this isn't a fraudulent claim, which is why there's 2 months there where he only has a small advance from Mr. Lovell, which gets stolen, and then he has to wait to come into this £1,000 of money. And in the meantime, he won't let anyone know what he's going to do with it. Hence the mystery.
Yes, and so these people that he meets in this community that he goes into, they don't really know whether to trust him or not. And that's very well done, isn't it?
Yeah, the reason why Mr. Lovell takes back the New Jersey bills is because Mr. Smith has just met his daughters. And he's like, oh, actually, this could be a suitor for my daughters, in fact, and maybe I need to not try and screw him over.
Let's talk about the daughters. What did your book club make of Tabitha and Flora?
I think Tabitha is one of my favourite female characters I've read in a long, long time.
Really?
Did you not like her? We were obsessed with her. She's not likable. She's not a nice, kind person, but that's why she's so delightful.
I felt like I wasn't supposed to like her, so I didn't like her.
Oh, no, we loved her. Just to give a sense of Tabitha, she is this fierce, frustrated, angry young woman.
She's very angry.
And she takes Mr. Smith on a real ride. She's slightly mad, but
she's mean. She's a shrew.
She is a total shrew. But we loved her for that. Not you guys?
I liked her. I did like her, particularly at the end.
I think I felt sorry for her. There's that incredible scene later on in the book where his view of her really changes. I suppose previously she's been somewhat in a position of power, and then there comes to a point in the book where he really sees her as a victim. I thought that was just amazing, the way that that was written, and that sense that we have so much of this book. One of the things that's so wonderful about it is it's set in the 18th century, and you expect there to be a bit of distance there, but what he does so brilliantly is it feels so real. People behave the way you think people behave, and people's opinions of other people fluctuate. You know, they're not always the same. And this sudden view he has of Tabitha almost for the first time. And then what's wonderful about it is it doesn't actually end there, because their relationship continues to evolve and it goes in a slightly different arc from that point.
I thought her rage was absolutely believable. And that's why I liked her.
Yeah, I did as well. And I thought she gave the sense, perhaps better than some other aspects of the novel, of really what a small town New York was at this time, because her experiences and opportunities are so limited. Not that she would have had maybe greater opportunities in London, but London as a cosmopolitan place would have given her more experiences or opportunities for experiences. So, you know, she would still have just been expected to get married, but she would not have been in such a fairly isolated place. He really gave the sense that New York at this time, as busy and bustling and a center of trade and all those things, and the boy Quentin who can speak 8 languages or say coffee in 8 languages or whatever it is, I can't remember the number.
Including Latin.
You know, so there's that sense. But then with Tabitha, you get the sense of isolation, I think.
Yeah, because society, those who would be considered acceptable to be of her acquaintance, is teeny tiny. It's like maybe 10 families. We've been talking a lot about New York as this central character almost. It's so omnipresent in the plot and in terms of what it means for the characters' lives and interactions. But listeners, if you haven't read this book, you're like, what, New York? So let's give you a sense of how Frances Spufford describes it, because it's so different to what we think of as New York nowadays.
So in this scene in the chapter called All Hallows, the character, Mr. Smith, is coming out of the boarding house where he's decided to put up after his long journey on the ship, and he's just noticing things about the city. First he looks out his window and he sees all of the steeples of the church and the masts of the boats like a forest. And as he comes down, he describes what he's seeing. To the left, Broadway seemed to debouch onto a green common, with a complication of barriers or fences beyond it. But the flow of the traffic favoured by a majority the rightward direction, where the houses thickened, and the heart of the town plainly lay. That was the way the barrows of bread and the milk churns were going, and Smith strode with them, almost skipping. The cobbled roadbed seemed to lie along the top of the gentle hummock the island made, between the 2 rivers, as if it were following out the course of some mostly submerged creature's spine, with the cobbles as lumpish vertebrae. On both sides the side streets sloped down, but beyond Broadway, on the side where Mrs. Lee's door stood, the west side, he calculated, there was only 1 layer of building, backed by a few scraggy shacks. The lanes descended there to an uncertain shore, where rowing boats were drawn up in clumps of yellow grass, and wading birds stalked on mudflats exposed by the tide. The weight of the town seemed all to be to the east. It was there that the openings revealed descents tight-packed with tall houses in the mode of Amsterdam, where pyramids of doorsteps supported mid-air doorways, or rather, looking closer, in the modes of Amsterdam and of London intermingled, for the spindle-thin facades of the one style jostled now against the broader haunches of the other. It was from these windings that Smith had emerged in the rain last night, and it was on to these that the barrow-pushers and the costermongers, the merchants in a hurry, and the prentices on errands steadily streamed away from the main flow of the avenue.
It's incredibly atmospheric, isn't it? And I was thinking there's a detail at the end when one of the characters reflects back, and actually all of this, it's a brief period, this New York that Smith inhabits and Frances Spufford evokes, because when the Revolutionary Wars came, it was all destroyed. And there's something quite poignant about that. You get to know it so well, it's almost as if you live there. I just really like that. I think one of the other things that's going on is, again, as you get to know the place with Smith, you become more and more aware of the politics. There are 2 factions, aren't there? There is the side that's loyal to the crown and the king, and then there's the other side who are more self-interested, shall we say. You see the power plays at work, and Smith slightly haplessly gets caught up in that to a certain extent, doesn't he?
Yeah, and that leads to the character of Septimus Oakshott, who is a delightful character. I really enjoyed him. He's got a head like an egg.
He's almost like a Georgette Hare character.
So he's the governor's left-hand man.
Yeah.
And his role is actually even a bit more complicated than that, as you discover as the book goes on. But he, for whatever reason, is trying to befriend Mr. Smith, and they do become friends. But it's a very tenuous friendship because both of them have different goals, really. Mr. Smith is basically trying to keep his secret, and Septimus Oakeshott is trying to find out what that secret is. As is everyone else, I should say.
Septimus is the one character who still has strong ties to England. He has a family there. He has sisters, 6 sisters. Why he's called Septimus. In Hampshire. And so he's the one who says to Smith on a couple of occasions, this is not London. It's different here. You can't behave the same way. I mean, he's the one person who seems to understand that Smith is not getting that native understanding, and to help Smith understand that that's something he really lacks.
Yeah, because there's the political situation, there's also the religious situation, where you have all of these different Christian denominations bumping up against each other.
Yeah, and Septimus ends up being the person who explains New York to Smith.
So, as I said in the intro, this is a romping, rollicking novel. It's very cinematic. There's a lot of action set pieces, and it can be quite silly at times. And I did think that is because it is drawing on that 18th century tradition. I am no expert, it's very true, but I have taken a few classes in 18th century lit in my time. And I haven't read Tristram Shandy, but I have read Laurence Sterne's A Sentimental Journey Through Europe. And there is that sort of farcical thread in some 18th century literature.
Yeah, there definitely is. And Tristram Shandy is definitely farcical. But Spufford quotes Roderick Random, the Tobias Smollett novel at the beginning. And his novels were classically, as in the sense of the 18th century, rollicking and could be silly. Dickens loved them. And I noticed in this novel, as you said, a familiar vibe. And those intrusions of the narrator when he says, I will endeavor to explain piquet. I don't know if that's how you pronounce that weird card game.
Yeah.
The card game to me was almost like the money. I just didn't understand any of it. But I understood there were rules and some people understood it. But the narrator says that I will endeavor to explain this to you, but I may not do such a great job. And that's fairly common in 18th century literature, with the narrator interfering to explain or not, or confuse.
This is a book that's absolutely full of reveals, isn't it? And one of the great delights, I think, is in not knowing them in advance. I often see this book in charity shops, and this puzzled me because it's so good. It's a brilliant, brilliant novel. And I always think, why do people give it away? And then I was rereading it myself. And it suddenly dawned on me, of course, you're not ever going to have the same experience reading it the second time that you did the first, because so much of what pulls you through it is that sense of mystery, of not knowing. You know, you're desperate to know, why is Smith there? But not only that, there are all these sort of subplots that have these brilliant twists and turns that constantly keep you guessing and keep you on your toes. And I suddenly thought, aha, now I see. People probably give it away, I think, for that reason. Having said that, I found rereading it after about a year, when I'd forgotten most of the ins and outs of it, I actually did have pretty much the same pleasures. But yes, let's move then, because we're just dying to. Let's move into our spoiler section. So if you don't want to know what happens, then stop listening now. But if you do, then stay with us as we go deeper into Golden Hill by Francis Spufford.
So which spoiler to start with?
Well, yes, slavery is another of the threads that runs through this book. And you're not, as a reader, particularly aware of its importance until you find out more about Smith and why he's there.
And I was quite proud of myself in my book club because I clocked that something was going on with race and Mr. Smith's interest in slavery, because he has quite anachronistic attitudes towards slavery. And this is a reveal. He discovers that Septimus and Septimus's slave Achilles are actually lovers. And when he encounters them and confronts them, he is outraged not by the fact that they are lovers, but by the fact that Septimus is taking advantage of his slave in this way. He is furious. And I was like, really? I mean, great, like Mr. Smith, well done. But that didn't feel like how most people would respond back in the 18th century. And we learned that Achilles and Septimus are like lovers in every sense of the word. You know, they care about each other deeply. And so Mr. Smith is actually quite accepting of this relationship. But I was like, that's interesting. And Mr. Smith also is quite observant of Sapphira, who is the slave in the Lovells household too. And I was like, okay, that's interesting.
What about you, Phyllis? Did you see it coming?
I'm not sure. I saw something coming. It's hard for me because, like you, I read it a long time ago and just reread it. So I was picking up more references this time that I hadn't picked up last time. For example, there are a couple of instances where people are looking at Mr. Smith in a certain way and noticing something about him. And we get little hints of that. That scene with Achilles and Septimus is interesting, and his response to it. And in fact, that's what Septimus says when Mr. Smith upbraids him for taking advantage of his slave for his own pleasures. Septimus's response is, oh, gosh, that's an interesting response. That's not what he would have expected. He's expecting the outrage of the mix of races or whatever. So the attitudes of Smith and those small moments where he's noticing the slaves, I think on my first reading, I probably wasn't that alert to it. I was assuming it was part of the atmosphere and background of New York at the time. And I was fairly surprised. It's not a reveal in the sense that where you thought there was nothing, there was something. You think there is something, you don't know what the something is.
I was almost a tiny bit disappointed when at the end you find out that the money has been in order that he can buy these slaves to set them free, and then he's taking them all off. He's got about 20 people, hasn't he, in a cart, and he's taking them all off. You don't know where they're going, but the idea is that he's taking them off somewhere where they can live freely. After all the mystery, it almost felt a bit like, oh, it was that. But
how callous are you?
No, I know. I mean, it was good. It was good, that, I suppose. But
what I found tricky with that ending is that there was nowhere for them to go.
Exactly. That's what didn't make sense to me.
They would be safe.
Because we've already established that New York is this island, and as Tabitha says so eloquently, there's nothing beyond it except woods and people who would be quite hostile. So, yeah, I think it's that thing of there wasn't really any explanation. Well, where are they going to go? How are they going to be safe? How's he going to look after them? I think perhaps that's what frustrated me about it, not finding out that, in fact, he had quite a noble purpose. That was good. I like that, obviously.
Historically, he's adhering to some facts. There was an attempt to take slaves up to a northern province to establish some sort of, I don't want to call it a colony, maybe it was some sort of colony where slaves could live freely. It wasn't successful. It failed, I think, for all the reasons you can imagine. And I really liked that passage where Tabitha says, there is nothing. You're not going to find little cottages and taverns and things. There is just nothing but trees, and you'll die. So I think in that sense, it's disappointing, but it's not as unrealistic, sadly, as it maybe seems.
We skipped over the fact that Mr. Smith is mixed race. So if anyone hasn't read the book, that's what we've been talking around, which is that his grandfather was an enslaved black man, and he was much beloved by a nobleman's family, and so he was freed, and his descendants married white women, which is why Mr. Smith can pass as a white man. And I mean, that is one of the pleasures at the end, is that everyone who's been circling around him and, trying to court his favor finds out that they have been deferential to what they consider to be a black man who therefore is not their equal, and they're all outraged. But by that point, Mr. Smith is gone.
And so Tabitha has her chance, doesn't she, to go with him. He tries to persuade her. And I thought that was such a beautiful scene where he really looks into her eyes, looks into her heart. He really sees her for what she is, and he says, come with me. And she just can't bring herself to, and it ends in this almost scene of madness where she's just screaming her rage and frustration, and that sort of made sense to me, but at the same time, I kind of wanted there to be the Beatrice and Benedict ending, sort of wanted it to end well for them. I liked it that it didn't, but I guess I would have liked it more if, they'd gone off on the wagon together.
Well, he does manage, though, to take Achilles with him, and Zafira, who is the household slave of the Lovell family. And the final twist, and I think this is a twist, is that Tabitha is our narrator. Yeah. She is telling this story in her old age, looking back and wishing she had the courage to leave with Mr. Smith.
It's brilliant, because you find out it was her story all along. It wasn't his. It's so good, the ending. The final twist in a twisty, twisty, twisty novel.
Yeah, I really like that. I really like that it was Tabitha. I really like that she had the last word, even if it was to talk about her own failing to grasp an opportunity. I just really like that it was her.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was wonderful.
Yeah, I agree. It was great. So what did your book club think of it?
My book club really loved it. Yeah, everyone loved it. It was a fairly small gathering, but other people have since been texting on our WhatsApp group, and they did keep reading it. They didn't start it and stop. They couldn't make the session, but they read it all the way through. And I think it was a really good book club book because we did have a lot to say.
I thought it was so finely balanced. That was one of the things I admired most about it, was that brilliant balance between character and plot and the way it's written. It's just so pleasing. His way of describing things, the sort of sense of a kind of homage to a tradition of literature that he obviously loves. You can just sort of tell there's this sort of warmth and affection for that style of writing, I think, that comes through. You know, he obviously took pleasure in it, and you take pleasure in reading it. So as a piece of writing, it was just such a pleasure to read because it was so well done. And then, yeah, just great story. Phyllis?
I really loved it. I agree with you. I think that it was finely balanced. I thought there was a lot of historical detail and background and atmosphere that could put people off, I suppose. It doesn't put me off, but I thought that the narrative was strong enough that all of that stuff was part of the story. So it wasn't like it was this kind of didactic exercise and this is what New York was like and this is what money was like. It makes it real for this character who has to negotiate all these things, negotiate in lots of different ways, not just financially, but negotiate his way into this society, which is a different kind of society. And that came through as well, I thought, really well, that how different these people in New York, in this colony, although they had all these things in common with their brethren in England, it was a very different society. These ideas of virtue and liberty coupled with this dark threat of violence and lack of justice. They could deal with him in any way they saw fit, really, even though he had these connections with this financial house. That was his only protection. And so you got a really good sense of just how dangerous New York was in that sense. But also, as you said, the city, I loved when they were running across the roofs. I know that's part of the cover image, so you kind of get that in your mind already. But it was almost like a Disney thing where they're running across these rooftops and you get this sense of what New York was like with all these Dutch and English-style houses just smashed next to each other. I thought that was wonderful.
You have to imagine that the film rights have been bought to this book, don't you? Because so much happens and it's so atmospheric and there's so many set action pieces that in a film wouldn't feel strange, but actually reading them in a historical novel, you're like, gosh, they're running over the rooftops now? What's happening here? And then there's the trial scene. There's a lot of action and drama, and hence why we keep calling it rollicking. They really didn't time it well, did they? Just thinking about the plan. Why did he arrive in November?
Yeah.
Might have made a lot more sense if he'd arrived in like April, and then they could have headed off into like the summer sunset.
That's right, and gone to some tropical place.
Well, and there's a sense, isn't there, perhaps about the naivety about that, you know, that he didn't really understand what he was going into. He doesn't really understand, you know, he starts to learn. But I loved his self-possession, and again going back to that sense of balance, the sense that he makes mistakes and he stumbles into things, and in some ways he's foolish, but then in other ways there is a sort of nobility about him and his spirit and his character that shines through, and so you do end up rooting for him and liking him, and I kind of felt like learning from him a little bit in a way.
Yeah, and he's so charismatic and accomplished, and I think Francis Spufford is very much able to explain why that is. And that's why he's such a mystery as well to all these New Yorkers. They're like, where do you fit? How do you know Latin? How do you know that? How have you traveled all over Europe? Who are you? And why won't you tell us?
So, good book club book.
Great book club book. Great read. Really enjoyed it. Highly recommend. Inspired by Golden Hill, here are some recommendations for your next book club read.
I'm going to recommend an old favourite.
Oh, go on.
The Prophets of Eternal Fjord
No!
by Kim Leine. Yes!
Don't listen to her.
Yes,
Don't do it.
Yes. Idealistic, misguided Morten Falk is a newly ordained priest sailing to Greenland in 1787 to convert the Inuit to the Danish church. A rugged outpost battered by harsh winters, Sukkertoppen is overshadowed by the threat of dissent. Natives from neighbouring villages have united to reject Danish rule and establish their own settlement atop Eternal Fjord. As Falk becomes involved with those in his care, his faith and reputation are dangerously called into question. It came to mind because, for me, this was a fantastic historical novel. It's almost a bit more visceral than Golden Hill. You really sort of smell it and taste it. You kind of feel the itch of the lice. They have a terrible time. There's never enough to eat. At one point, I think the character does end up eating his own shoes, you know. But what it does have is this sense of this colony, this very claustrophobic sense of this small community. I love the twists and turns. Our hero, in the way that we had Mr. Smith going out there this time, is this Morton Falk character.
Anti-hero.
Yeah, exactly. Who you sort of feel like you think he's going to be the one that you like. But actually, unlike Smith, he doesn't really have a moral centre or a compass. He tries, he does his best. But he's just incredibly inept and does everything really badly, and things almost never go his way. And I don't know why, but there was something really pleasing about that. I liked that. I felt like it sort of inverted my expectations of what was going to happen with this character. And again, it has some nice twists. I thought it was a wonderful read. My book club weren't so sure.
It's so long.
Laura hated it.
Bleak.
If you want to know
Grim.
more detail, you could always go back and listen to our podcast on it in our iTunes feed.
I recall using the term stomach churning at one point, so you have been warned.
Phyllis, how about you?
I'm going to go back to Sally Magnusson, The Sealwoman's Gift, which I really enjoyed. It's another historical novel. And it begins in Iceland with a group of Icelandic people who are taken captive and sold as slaves. And what's interesting in terms of that particular historical aspect is the numbers and kinds of people who were being taken and bought and sold as slaves in that period. It's based on a historic fact. This group were taken captive and they were taken to North Africa and sold, and they end up in Algiers. And the account of what happened was written by the head of one family who also happened to be a minister. And he was then sent to the Danish king, because Denmark had control over Iceland at the time, by these corsairs who really only did this to get ransom. And so he's sent off to the king of Denmark to beg for money to get back all these people who have been sold, including his wife and children. So you go from that bleak, dark, stomach-churning landscape to the beautiful sunlit terraces of Algiers, and a woman who is raised on the Icelandic sagas but is also indoctrinated in the ways of Scheherazade and the tales of the Arabian Nights. And that's what I really loved about it as someone who loves stories, is how the telling of stories is so important to help her get through and explain the world to herself and to what's...
That sounds good. Laura?
I am going to recommend The Western Wind by Samantha Harvey, which we spoke about not too long ago on a bookshelf episode. And if you did listen to that, you would know that I didn't actually love this book. But I think it would be a great book club book because it has had rave reviews. It's come out in the last year. It was a Waterstones Book of the Month. And crucially, it is short. Historical novels are bloody long. Another reason not to read Prophets of Eternal Fjord is it's like 600 pages of really, really dense type. Golden Hill is quite long, but it's so plot-driven that it's fairly easy to speed through. I don't know about The Sealwoman.
That's probably more Golden Hill.
Okay,
right?
so 400 pages or so. The Western Wind is maybe about 200, 250. It is set in 15th century Somerset in March over 5 days. And the local priest, our narrator, our main character, is under pressure to discover what has happened to this tiny isolated village's wealthiest man who has disappeared into a roaring river. It's been raining for weeks and weeks. It's bleak English winter, and similar to Prophets of Eternal Fjord, you really feel what it would have been like to live back then. It would not have been pleasant. I think Algiers might have been looking quite good, in fact.
Algiers seems lovely. It smells nice, and there's lots of nice food.
And it's warm, great. But this is a small English village, and similar to Golden Hill, you get a real sense of what life would have been like in a tiny community. I think there's 7,000 people living in New York at the time. In this village, there's only about 120. I don't know, you just get this sense of how tenuous life was back then, and the structures that you existed within were always capable of being kind of blown away by circumstance. And yes, it's short, so I think it'd be a really good book club book.
And just to go back to your book, Phyllis, House of Fiction, you go from earlier writers all the way through to modern authors, Ian Fleming, Agatha Christie. Obviously, you had to do a lot of reading to write this book. Were there any discoveries for you? Were there any books that kind of came out you loved that you hadn't realised?
I made one discovery, which is not about a book, but it was about a house. And I was so excited and such a nerd about it. I mean, it was one of those really nerdy discoveries. I think there are probably 5 people who are interested, but there might be listening, so I'll speak to them. I didn't realize when I started out that I was going to need to write pretty much potted biographies of every single author I was talking about. But in order to illustrate their life and their connection with a particular house, Virginia Woolf and her really emotional, mental, soulful, spiritual connections with the houses that she lived in, things like that, became a huge task. But the one house that I was really trying to find was to do with the Forsyte saga. That was written by John Galsworthy at the turn of the century. It was published in 1906, the original trilogy. The first story was called The Man of Property. And Galsworthy was one of these Edwardian authors who was stuck in this kind of really rigid social structure, in that he came from a family of businessmen. He was expected to be a lawyer. It was one of the books that really sparked my imagination to write about writers and houses, because he presents probably the first modern house in English literature in the Forsyte saga, in the house at Robin Hill. Being a man of property and seeing everything as a business transaction, and having married someone for whom he has feelings of ownership rather than love, and she is appalled by him. She falls in love with this architect, and at the center of it is this house, and the description of the house is so particular. I thought he must be referring to a house. There must be something there. This inner courtyard, it's quite exotic in some ways, but very plain on the outside. There's a lot of argument in the novel about the house. The architect is avant-garde. The old Forsyte family don't understand it. They don't understand why he's spending so much money on this very strange house. It's got a courtyard that's going to be paved in iridescent tiles, and there's a fountain in the middle, and there's going to be a purple leather curtain, and there's going to be these columns going all around it, and it's just got this very, very specific description of these details. And I thought, there must be, this didn't come from nowhere. There's something somewhere. But what I learned was that John Galsworthy, at the time that he was writing, had fallen in love with his cousin's wife. So a very similar situation to what happens in The Man of Property. And Galsworthy, being a man of huge principle, refused to have the affair made public, even though most everybody knew about it. His sister was married to a well-known painter. They had a house in Holland Park. They hung around with arty people. So I think that a lot of artists who were living in that area in Chelsea, who were having artist studios built around this time, double-height studios with lots of light coming in, that must have influenced him. But the point was, for me, that no one knew. No one had ever written both television series. Nobody knew which house he was talking about. And in fact, the last television series, they said they sort of combined looking at houses by Frank Lloyd Wright and Voysey and Charles Rennie Mackintosh, and sort of they put that all together and decided that's what Robin Hill was supposed to look like. And so I was trawling through lots of stuff trying to find information. I went up to the library in Birmingham and found diaries belonging to Galsworthy's mother and sisters, and there were these little tiny pocket diaries written in with pencil, which was really maddening because it's hard to read. And I found a larger diary, and it said John Galsworthy. And I thought, hooray, here it is. And I opened it up, like the first 20 pages had just been very neatly sliced out of it.
No!
And so I was just about to cry. But then I found, and this was all just tossed into a box. I mean, he'd left his papers to Birmingham, and then Fortune magazine bought a lot of it. I don't know why, probably because it was about business. But there was a handwritten list of where a lot of the things had gone, and it said, item number 7 or something, plans for the house at Robin Hill, British Library. And I just thought, okay. So I raced back home, and the next day went into the manuscripts at the British Library and found a massive portfolio that had all these very odd things in it, letters and documents and things. And then there they were, these drawings. So it wasn't the house that actually existed, but it was the house as Galsworthy had drawn it. And he actually had drawn specific plans of this house in Robin Hill. He drew the front elevation, the rear elevation, the floor plan, the room with the purple curtain. And originally when I was looking to try to find a model, I was putting everything into Google, and I was putting, purple leather curtain, which got some results that I really wasn't interested in. Though the closest I could come was these artist studios in Chelsea, Leighton House, probably because Lord Leighton was building that house at the time with his very exotic tile inside and things like that. So that must have affected it. So that was the main quest that I had, to find out something. And I didn't find what I was looking for, but I found something that I thought was exciting anyway.
Yeah. And of all the books that you had to delve into in order to write this, I mean, I could tell, actually, you're right, the amount of work that's just gone into each chapter, because what they are is a really brilliant summary and overview of a writer's life and work, all neatly encapsulated for you into about sort of 30 pages. And also this really, all this lovely, interesting stuff about these fictional houses and these real houses and how the writers felt about them. But were there any books, perhaps in particular, that you think might be good for a book club?
Gosh, that's a good question. I suppose I'm not sure people would get as much out of Tristram Shandy as I would like them to, but I just think it's such a wacky novel and it's so surprising. And I think it's a great representation of human wit and knowledge, and it's so modern. That's the thing about it that I think will surprise people. It is so what we would call modern. We would think it's modern.
Is it as rude as Laurence Sterne's A Sentimental Journey?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's what I always remember, like the big shock about reading Laurence
Yeah,
Sterne.
well-
It's like, it's just rude.
They're quite bawdy.
Yeah,
Very
He's quite
bawdy.
bawdy. Yeah. And he was a country parson who had a lot of experience writing political pamphlets for his uncle. But in those days, being a parson didn't mean that you were necessarily religious. It was one of very few careers open to lower gentry or second sons or things like that. So I don't think Laurence Sterne became a parson as because
Out of religious conviction.
yes. But it's just talk about rollicking. I mean, it's absolutely rollicking, and these conversations that are quasi-philosophical and then come back to the winding of the clock during intercourse. So I mean, that would be an effort. That would be an effort for a book club book, but worth it.
I'd like to think that one day I will read it. I'm a little bit daunted. I think that's why I've never ventured to dive in, but I loved reading your writing about it.
Thank you.
And I think House of Fiction would also be a good thing for book clubs to look at, just because it has so many, it's sort of so inspiring about so many different writers. So I think I could also recommend that, and it is out in paperback around now, isn't it?
It is.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me. You're very kind. I'd be interested to listen to all of your podcasts now about all the books that I haven't read.
We'll listen to the one about Prophets of Eternal Fjord, and then you'll be able to make a really informed decision about whether to read it or not.
Yes, I will, I promise.
That's all for this episode. On our next book club show, we'll be discussing I Will Never See the World Again by the renowned Turkish novelist Ahmet Altan. An icon in his native country, Altan was sentenced to life imprisonment by Recep Erdogan's oppressive regime.
In this series of extraordinary essays smuggled out from his prison cell by lawyers, Altan reflects upon his sentence, on a life whittled down to a courtyard covered by bars, and on the hope and solace a writer's mind can provide, even in the darkest of places. Did it make for a good book club discussion?
Listen in to find out. Coming up soon is our bookshelf episode, where we discuss the non-book club books we've been reading, yes, it does happen, and whether or not we think they'd be good for book club.
If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or you can email us at thebookclubreview@gmail.com.
And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts.
But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.